Generation X was not raised with encouragement. They weren't told to chase happiness. They weren't asked how they felt. They were raised with a rule that was never spoken out loud, but quietly enforced every single day. Don't complain. Don't rely on anyone. Handle it yourself. Most people from Generation X don't even remember learning this rule. It wasn't explained. It was absorbed. It came from coming home to empty houses, from figuring things out alone, from parents who were present in body but absent in emotional availability. This generation didn't grow up being told they were special. They grew up learning how to survive without attention. Today, Generation X is often described as distant, emotionally closed off, overly independent, or even cold. But that description misses the truth. They aren't emotionally broken. They were emotionally trained. They learned early that emotions slow you down, that asking for help makes you vulnerable, that the world keeps moving whether you're struggling or not. So they adapted. They became self-reliant before they were ready, responsible before they were mature, independent before they were safe. And once that's your foundation, it shapes everything. The world Generation X grew up in was not gentle, it was transitional. Divorce rates were rising. Both parents were suddenly working. Economic certainty was fading. Authority figures were losing credibility. Children were expected to adapt without guidance. They learned how to cook their own food, manage their own time, solve their own problems. No one asked if they were overwhelmed. The expectation was simple: figure it out. And they did. What Generation X internalized was this idea: your emotions are your responsibility. The world does not owe you understanding. Not because parents were cruel, but because they themselves were surviving. So, feelings became private, struggles became invisible, strength became silent. Generation X learned how to function while hurting. They went to school anxious, went to work depressed, built families while emotionally exhausted, and they rarely talked about it. Not because they didn't feel deeply, but because feeling deeply never came with support. This is why Generation X doesn't perform emotions. They are not unemotional, they are emotionally efficient. They express feelings only when there's a reason, only when it serves a purpose. Because growing up taught them that emotions are liabilities unless controlled. They learned to sit with discomfort, to tolerate uncertainty, to endure quietly. That's why they often become the stable one in a crisis, the calm one, the one who handles things without panic. Chaos feels familiar to them. Uncertainty feels normal. But this strength comes at a cost: connection. When you grow up believing your needs are burdens, you stop expressing them. You become low maintenance, self-sufficient, easy to be around, but difficult to truly know. Many people from Generation X learned how to love without leaning, how to care without depending, how to commit without exposing vulnerability. They value loyalty deeply, but struggle with emotional openness. When relationships fail, they don't always fight loudly. They withdraw, quietly, cleanly, because needing someone was never part of the training. If you're listening to this and you're from Generation X, pause for a moment. Think back. Were you expected to handle things on your own even when no one said it directly? If that resonates, write yes in the comments. You're not alone, even if it often felt that way. Over time, Generation X became strong by disappearing. They didn't demand attention. They didn't reshape culture loudly. They didn't dominate public conversations. They adapted instead. And in a world that rewards visibility, adaptation looks like absence. That's why Generation X is often overlooked, misunderstood, underrepresented. Yet they are everywhere, holding systems together, keeping families stable, maintaining workplaces, doing what they've always done, handling it. As they got older, the world changed again. Suddenly, emotions mattered. Therapy was normalized. Vulnerability became acceptable. and many from Generation X were left confused. Now it's okay to talk about this? Now it matters? But by then, the habit of silence was already built in. They sit between generations, too emotionally aware to be numb, too emotionally trained to be expressive, wanting connection but unsure how to ask for it. If this is starting to describe someone you know or yourself, take a moment to like this video. It helps stories like this reach people who rarely hear their experiences explained out loud. Generation X is often labeled cynical or pessimistic, but they're not pessimistic, they're prepared. They don't expect systems to work. They don't assume help will arrive. They don't rely on optimism, because life taught them early that hope is optional, but preparation is necessary. Today, many from Generation X are exhausted, not physically, not dramatically, existentially. They are caring for aging parents, supporting adult children, navigating unstable careers, all while doing what they've always done, holding it together, quietly.
What makes this exhaustion heavier is that Generation X rarely talks about it. They don't announce burnout. They don't dramatize struggle. They normalize it. They tell themselves this is just how life works, that everyone is tired, that complaining doesn't change anything. So the weight stays internal. Over time, that creates something dangerous: emotional compression. Feelings that were never expressed don't disappear, they settle, they harden. They show up later as irritability, as emotional numbness, as sudden withdrawal. Not because Generation X lacks empathy, but because they've been carrying too much for too long. This is also why many people from Generation X struggle with asking for help. Help feels like failure, like weakness, like proof they didn't manage things correctly. Even when they desperately need support, they hesitate. They were raised to believe that competence is measured by how little you need. So they keep going. At work, Generation X is often the most reliable. They show up early, they stay late, they don't ask for much. They don't need praise, they don't demand recognition, but they do notice when they're taken for granted, silently. Over time, that creates resentment, not loud resentment, quiet disappointment, the kind that slowly disconnects you from people, from institutions, from purpose. And because they don't externalize it, others rarely see it coming. From the outside, they look fine. On the inside, they're depleted. This is where the misunderstanding between generations deepens. Younger generations often see Generation X as emotionally distant or disengaged, uninterested in emotional conversations, uncomfortable with vulnerability. But what they don't see is the context. Generation X didn't grow up learning how to process emotions together. They learned how to survive alone. So when younger generations openly express feelings, Generation X doesn't feel threatened. They feel confused. Not because it's wrong, but because it contradicts everything they were trained to believe. They wonder how the world suddenly has space for this when they were told there wasn't. This creates a quiet internal conflict. Part of them admires the openness, another part doesn't trust it. Because when you've learned that emotional exposure leads nowhere, safety becomes control, and control feels like survival. In relationships, this can look like distance, but it's actually protection. Many from Generation X want closeness, they want connection, but they fear dependency. They don't want to need someone the way they once needed adults who weren't there. So, they give love in practical ways, through responsibility, through loyalty, through consistency, not always through words. If you're in a relationship with someone from Generation X, this is important to understand. Their silence is not absence of care. Their independence is not rejection. It's how they learned to stay safe. And yet, even safety has limits. Eventually, emotional suppression asks for a price. It shows up as midlife questioning, as a quiet sense of emptiness, as a feeling that life has been managed but not fully lived. Many from Generation X reach a point where the unspoken rule no longer works. Handle it yourself. Don't complain. Don't depend. Because at some point, the load becomes too heavy for one person to carry alone. This is the moment many are in right now. Not a breakdown, a reckoning. A realization that strength without connection is not sustainable, that self-reliance without support becomes isolation, and that survival is not the same as fulfillment. This doesn't mean Generation X needs to become someone else. It doesn't mean abandoning independence. It means updating the rule. Recognizing that asking for help is not weakness, that emotional expression is not failure, that connection does not erase strength. It refines it. Generation X has already done the hardest part. They survived instability. They adapted without guidance. They built resilience from absence. Now comes the unfamiliar part, letting themselves be seen. Not loudly, not performatively, but honestly. If you're from Generation X and this resonates, write one word in the comments. Seen. Not for anyone else, for yourself. Because being understood doesn't erase the past, but it can change what comes next. If you want more content that explains the psychology behind generations, identity, and emotional patterns we rarely talk about, subscribe to the channel. Some stories were lived quietly, but they still deserve to be told. Generation X was shaped by an unspoken rule, and understanding that rule doesn't weaken them. It finally gives their strength context.